Welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Show. One of the subjects that has been completely off my radar, basically, since the Hamas invasion of October 7th, has been the war that nobody could think about anything other than, which is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war between those two countries that has been going on now. Next year, it'll be next month, it'll be 2 years. Over the weekend, I read an important article that my friend and the friend of the Caroline Glick Show, David Goldman, wrote in The American Mind. It's titled Israel in the Shadow of American Decline. And after I read it, I just turned to David and I said, look, we have to talk about this, because basically in David's article, he brings together the state of the war, the dismal state from a Ukrainian and U.S. perspective of the war between Ukraine and Russia, and he brings it together with the war that Israel is now fighting against Iran and its proxies, first and foremost, of course, Hamas. So without further ado, David, welcome back to the Caroline Glick Show. Thanks for coming. It's been a while.
Caroline, it's always a privilege and pleasure to spend time with you, so thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, it's certainly a mutual privilege, if that at all, if you truly are privileged, but I certainly am. So I thank you again for coming on. Can we just start with you sort of giving a summary of your claims, your arguments in the article that came out on December 19th?
Well, my epigraph for the article was Jeremiah's warning that the pot is boiling towards the north. The real danger comes from the north. And of course, Jeremiah was dealing with a situation where the ancient state of Israel, the second Commonwealth, the first Commonwealth, was an ally of a declining power, namely Egypt, and fighting Babylon, which of course conquered us and enslaved us and destroyed the Jewish kingdom. I wouldn't call this a Jeremiah, but I think that the greatest danger to Israel in the medium term is not Gaza, because, frankly, a modern army is eventually going to win against lightly armed irregulars, however fanatical and murderous they might be. The real danger is that Israel is the ally of a power which has made so many grotesque blunders that it's created a circumstance where it's in significant danger of losing influence, and perhaps losing influence catastrophically.
You're talking about America or Israel?
I'm talking about America. Israel has a great deal of maneuvering room, and it's much too early and too complex to suggest a particular course of action for Israel. But when we look back on the past more than 20 years of forever wars, the United States in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and so forth spent, $7 trillion, roughly, pursuing the phantom of the Arab Spring, of Arab democracy, and so forth, and ended up with less than nothing to show for it, a decline in influence. And then I think the United States got itself into this mess in Ukraine by insisting on pushing the boundary of NATO right up to the Ukrainian-Russian border, which the Russians viewed as an existential threat to the Russian state and decided to fight a war to prevent. Now, at the beginning of the war, if you recall, President Biden said confidently Putin cannot be allowed to remain in power. He predicted regime change in Russia. He claimed that the Russian economy would shrink by 50% because of the sanctions that we placed on Russia. And 2 years later, the Russian economy is still roughly the same size it was at the beginning. It actually grown by a slight margin. It's outproducing NATO as a whole in war material by a significant margin, by perhaps 2-1. The Ukrainians are running out of people and they're running out of ammunition, and the West, the funders of Ukraine, are running out of patience. Witness the refusal of the Senate Republicans to pass funds to Ukraine unless they get a deal with President Biden on the border, and similar foot dragging in the European Union. So we face the prospect that the United States and NATO, having put a huge amount of their credibility and a great deal of treasure and armaments behind the Ukrainian government, may face sometime in the first half of this year a collapse of the Zelensky government and a true military loss. And the blow to Western prestige would be comparable to the loss of Vietnam in 1975, and perhaps even greater. And I think the situation is so dramatic that everyone in the world is circling this, trying to figure out how best to exploit it and what to do next.
So wait, let me stop you there, because
yes.
Before you go into that, because there's a lot of stuff to discuss here. So, I mean, I guess part of it is just bemoaning, right? Because it seemed 2 years ago that the United States, I mean, it seemed to me, maybe because I was reading you, but that the United States was kind of had not thought any of this through ahead of time, that they hadn't thought through how difficult it was going to be to push back Russia. They set massive goals for the war without thinking about what it was going to take to achieve them, and whether the United States was willing to do what was necessary to achieve them. So it staked out a very not extreme, but very ambitious positions and goals without thinking through the means that were going to be required. How did that happen? I mean, it at a minimum, it was just deeply irresponsible, and it feels like, with all of the professionals, think what you like about them in relation to Israel, but these people, I mean, they're not dumb, and they do have a world of experience, and yet it seems like no significant thought was placed in setting goals that were achievable given the means that the United States was willing to use to achieve any goals whatsoever in relation to Ukraine. Why do you think that happened?
The history of warfare is a history of grotesque and catastrophic blunders. When we get into war, when we read it after the fact, we tend to have a sense of inevitability. Things played out as if they were a Greek tragedy, where things were foreordained and fate takes us in a certain direction. But if you look at the details, most governments that started wars start with really stupid actions. One could ask, how is it possible that Israel allowed Hamas to break through the fence and send thousands of terrorists in? There was no reason that should have happened. Israel certainly had the capability to stop it, but it didn't.
It's true, but it's slightly different. It's slightly different, or maybe significantly different, in that, Israel was invaded. This was a surprise attack, but the United States' decision making in relation to Ukraine was not made in the face of a surprise. It was made with certain expectations, with Russia having declared intentions, and with the United States having thought through or not thought through the implications of their desire to expand NATO to Russia's doorstep.
We thought it through, but we thought it through completely wrong. We believed that the economic sanctions would crush Russia. Remember, we seized $600 billion worth of Russian foreign exchange reserves. Nothing like this has ever been done outside of a declaration of war. We seized some Iranian assets, but this kind of massive seizure of Russia's reserves is unprecedented. And we believe that by cutting off their access to trade, technology, their ability to sell oil, and so forth, we would shut down the Russian economy. That was Biden's prediction in public, 50% decline in the Russian economy. Of course, no such thing happened. The reason is the rest of the world reoriented its trade and financing flows to get around the American sanctions and created a giant vacuum where American power used to be. The core of American soft power is the use of the U.S. dollar in trade financing and the banking system, the ability to make transactions through, for example, the SWIFT network. We thought once we shut that off, Russia would fold. In fact, India and China became Russia's best markets for its hydrocarbons, for oil and gas. Russia discounted a bit, and the Indians suddenly became Russia's best customer. Remember, India was supposed to be our great ally against China in the Quad and so forth. And India turned on its heel and stuck with its old friend Russia, which had been an Indian ally since independence. The Chinese bought all of the Russian energy they could and arranged to get more through pipelines and other means overland, which of course they like. The Turks, the Georgians, the Armenians, all these stands of the former Soviet Union became sieves through which massive amounts of Chinese technology could pass. So, for example, all the spare parts, all of the semiconductors, all the electronics that the Russians themselves were not particularly good at making, passed very easily through intermediaries. And the Turks, despite American threats, did a land office business, selling Chinese and other parts to the Russians. And the last thing we completely got wrong is how strong Russian capacity was in basic armaments production. The Russians have a lot of a great inventory of conventional weapons. They managed to use drones and other targeting to turn World War II technology, like 155 millimeter howitzers, into smart weapons. They very quickly adapted to Western technology. They've been winning the drone war, which has been a key component. So technologically, the Russians surprised us. The reorientation of trade flows surprised us. And we sat there, metaphorically, with our pants down, looking like idiots, because our plans to crush the Russian economy and force regime change on Russia disappeared.
Okay, so wait, let me just pause at one thing, and then I want to shift to Israel. So from reading you in particular over the past many years, I mean, and also Lee Smith and others who have talked about the gutting of American manufacturing capabilities, it seems to me that in Ukraine and in many other areas, including Afghanistan and the withdrawal from Afghanistan that Joe Biden did, the United States have failed to understand the difference between their position as this economic colossus holding up the entire international financial system in 1992 and where they are today, where the Chinese economy is almost equal to the size of the American economy, and you have a lot of other economies that are similarly much larger in relation to the United States than they were a generation ago at the end of the Cold War. And so the United States is partying and making policy as if they just won the Cold War and they're the sole global superpower. And in fact, they have completely ignored the dynamic nature of today's economic system and also of the power divide in the world, that it's much different than it was. I mean, do you think that that's right?
China's manufacturing is roughly 3 times U.S. manufacturing. In dollar terms, America's GDP is larger, though if you adjust for purchasing power parity, China's economy is larger, and you could take either measure depending on the context. But remember, for 30 years, we've been fighting goat herds. We've been fighting mainly irregulars or third world armies. We haven't fought a peer military opponent really since World War II. So we've allowed the basic defense industrial base to atrophy. One of the things I find utterly shocking, well beyond my most pessimistic expectations, is our inability to produce basic things like howitzer ammunition. And one of the great developments in warfare, which we've seen in Ukraine, is that the combination of satellite guidance, drones, and old-fashioned pinpoint artillery has created an entirely different kind of battlefield. The element of surprise and maneuver is no longer possible because satellites and drones can see everything that's happening on the ground. So the possibility for a surprise attack like the German Blitzkrieg in World War II or the Israeli Blitzkrieg in 1967, completely out of possibility. What counts is the amount of pinpoint ammunition you can deliver to well-identified targets. Right now, the Ukrainians are firing roughly a tenth the number of artillery shells that the Russians can fire because NATO as a whole does not have the capacity to produce them. Now, I believe if Biden at the beginning of the war had invoked the Defense Production Act and had added a crash program, we might be in a better state right now. But in our complacency and our negligence, we essentially did nothing. 70% or more of all casualties in the Ukraine war are caused by artillery. Artillery is the king of the battlefield, once again, as it was in Napoleonic times, but with pinpoint accuracy due to drone targeting, which means the Russians can inflict more casualties on the Ukrainians than the Ukrainians can inflict on the Russians. And this is a critical element because Ukraine has effectively a population of 32 million on the ground. Nominally, it's 43 million, but so many people have left the country that their effective population is less than 30. Russia has 147 million people, minus the 500,000 or so who've fled to avoid the draft. So it's roughly a 5-to-1 population advantage. You read casualty
Although that's
figures.
not that important, right? Because almost the entire war is being fought on Ukrainian territory. So, I mean, the Russia's population advantage would be more significant if Ukraine was attacking Russia in Russia, but it's not. It's attacking Russian forces.
Russian total Ukrainian casualties, by the best measures I've seen from top U.S. military intelligence people who do their own estimates based on public source information, is about 350,000 Ukrainian casualties, including 150,000 killed in action and a bit less Russian. Ukrainian casualties are somewhat higher, not hugely higher, than Russian casualties. And right now they're putting 50 to 60-year-old people in the field. They're dragooning people out of essential civilian functions. They're beginning to scrape the bottom of the barrel in terms of available manpower. And when that happens, that's the beginning of the end. That's what happened to Germany in 1918 at a certain point, with America sending 1 million men into the battlefield. Germany, in 1918, simply ran out of enough people to hold the front, and at some point the front collapsed. Ukraine is being hollowed out as we speak. How long that will take, I can't tell you. It could take 2 months, it could take 12 months. But barring some significant Russian error, which is still possible, the logic of this is that the Ukrainian army at some point will implode through lack of manpower the way the Germans imploded in 1918. The front will collapse, and at that point, Russia will be able to dictate a peace to Ukraine. Now, before we started taping, you mentioned Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, who made a statement which I think has to be viewed as a Russian sense of humor, saying that Russia's war aims in Ukraine were essentially the same as Israel's war aims in Gaza, namely to destroy the Ukrainian fascists and so forth. But there is a real content to that, apart from being nasty, which is Russia is not thinking in terms of any particular territorial gain. What they want to do is demilitarize Ukraine and destroy its capacity to fight for all time going forward. And that's essentially what Israel wants to do to Hamas, destroy its capacity to fight. Exactly how that's to be done, you probably know better than I. But the Russian war objective is the destruction of an American proxy and a NATO proxy.
So, no, I just want to pivot for a second because we're looking at this. This is, I don't think anybody would doubt, an American war. I mean, in the sense that the United States blocked compromise before the Russian invasion, insisted that they were going forward with their plans to bring Ukraine into NATO, did not want to see the implementation of the Minsk Accords, and so on and so forth. And so, so this is, from a reputational perspective, calamity. Now, one would think that facing this disaster that they were, at least in part, authors of, obviously it was Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, but it would seem like a reasonable position to take for the United States to say we're going to double down on supporting Israel, because it's sort of in a more major way, but it would be a move sort of reminiscent of Ronald Reagan's decision to run away from Beirut after the Marine barracks bombing, because he didn't want to deal with Hezbollah and with the radical Islamists that were being run by Iran in a proxy war against the United States and Lebanon. But then he went and he invaded Grenada to kind of change the subject and rebuild America's reputation as a superpower who was actually capable of accomplishing something in a war.
Your point is very well taken.
So why wouldn't the United States be doing that with Israel? And they're actually backing away from Israel in a major way and doubling down on their policy to appease Iran in various battlefields, including Iran's nuclear program that's expanding and moving very quickly towards weaponization.
Well, Biden's in an election year. He doesn't want a wider war. He's very afraid of what the impact would be of a wider war. If you get into a war with Iran, oil prices go up by some gigantic margin. The gas price goes up at the pump. Everybody's unhappy. America takes casualties. Biden looks like he's out of control, so he's trying to keep that fire at a low smolder. It's also the case, as you indicate, that the United States, as a matter for the sake of its own credibility, has to support an ally that's been subject to a barbaric and unprovoked attack. So the United States is not going to back off from supporting Israel. But that's not Israel's problem in the long term. Israel has had a massive conventional advantage in dealing with Iran for a long time. Iran has no air force to speak of. They may be able to fly a few old F-4s. Israel rules the skies in Syria, and if it wants to conduct raids in Iran, it has the capability to do so, despite the fact the Russians have sold them some air defense systems. They probably sold them older versions that Israel knows how to neutralize. The real danger in the medium term is what happens if Russia decides to sell Iran its top-of-the-line equipment. For example, last month, the Iranians announced that they had a deal to buy the Su-35 fighter from Russia for the first time. The Su-35 as an airframe is pretty much every bit as good as the F-15s that the Israeli Air Force flies. The question is, what's the quality of the avionics? What's inside them? Israel has much better electronic warfare measures than anyone else in the world, possibly with some competition for the Chinese coming up or the Americans. Iran has nothing like that, but the Russians have excellent electronic warfare systems. What happens if Russia says, okay, United States, you decided to push us against the wall. We're going to get back at you by giving Iran the capacity to do real damage to you and your allies, such as Israel. The whole strategic balance between Iran and Israel could be affected as blowback from the Ukraine situation. That's been my biggest worry for 15 years. I wrote a piece in 2008 saying that if we push Russia to the wall, their obvious response is ally with Iran against us. And in my view, we've got a much bigger interest in preventing Iran from becoming a spoiler in the region than we do with Ukraine, where we have really no strategic interest. It does us no good to push the border of NATO up to the Russian-Ukraine border. So
Well, what's the
that's
United
a real
States'
danger.
interest? What is? I mean, I think we both would be in agreement that the United States has no strategic interest in appeasing Iran. But so many people in Washington for so long have insisted that the United States' top strategic interest in the Middle East is to appease Iran. And now when you see Iran's Houthi proxies, its Iraqi proxies, its Afghan proxies, and its Lebanese proxies, as well as its Palestinian proxies, attacking the United States, attacking U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. Of course, I forgot Syria in there. The entire country is an Iranian proxy, just as the entire country of Lebanon is an Iranian proxy. They're attacking U.S. forces in Syria, in Iraq. The United States has barely responded to any of it. They're ending freedom of the seas in the Red Sea through the actions of Houthi pirates against merchant vessels, and the United States is doubling down. I mean, and they're expanding their uranium enrichment, and yet rather than stand with Israel, the United States is saying, Israel, restrain yourself in Lebanon. Pick up your marbles and go home in Gaza and just build a Palestinian state. And so they're saying all of it. And you think that all of this is because Biden doesn't care what the consequences are. He just wants quiet so that he can get through the election. Is that the only calculation that the United States is making right now?
Well, I think the Pentagon is telling the White House, I don't know whether Biden is compos mentis, but whoever is picking up the phone of the White House is being told, our resources are strained. We don't want to get into yet another conflict. We may not be able to manage it. So let's try to keep things quiet because it's not a good time for us to fight. And the White House, which is concerned with the political campaign, the last thing they want is another military misadventure, which looks bad. Now, of course, that doesn't constrain Israel, but the Iran situation is complicated. The obsession with bringing Iran into the regional security architecture starts with Robert Gates replacing Donald Rumsfeld as defense secretary in 2007. And that started with a Brzezinski-Gates task force at the Council on Foreign Relations in 2005, which proposed that, and that has been the doctrine of the foreign policy establishment, the blob, in Washington for the past really 20 years. You can't be promoted in the foreign
Rice
policy.
Actually pushed it forward significantly in our last 2 years in office and really set up the stage for Barack Obama to take over and escalate the policy.
Yes,
but not specific.
Obama's continuous with the Robert Gates policy that came in at the conclusion of the George W. Bush administration. But looking at the global map, for the standpoint of Tehran, you can see the United States looks weak in Ukraine. It looks weak in the Red Sea, and it looks very weak in Asia. The Chinese have built up a very impressive defensive force. I don't believe that China is in a mood to run around invading other countries. They hardly have any Marines or special forces. They only have 30,000 Marines total compared to 200,000 for the United States, for example. They don't have a lot of sea lift capability, but they have nearly 3,000 top-of-the-line surface-to-ship missiles, an excellent satellite system that can target any surface vessel within 1,000 miles of their coast. They have nearly 1,000 fourth and fifth generation aircraft based on their coast. We don't know how good they are, but from what we know, they don't seem to be that terrible. So the United States Expeditionary Force in the Pacific, which projects power at a range of many thousands of miles, is outgunned. What the world observed when Xi Jinping met Joe Biden in San Francisco in the middle of November was that the biggest ask on the part of the United States was, please, can we restore the hotline between the Chinese military and the U.S., which is a way of saying we are scared of a military accident and let's avoid any kind of violent situation. The United States looks weak and scared, and that's because it is weak and the Pentagon is scared. The uniformed military is afraid of the possible consequences of any kind of tangle with China within 1,000 miles of its coast. So you're the Iranians. You see the United States having run ignominiously out of Afghanistan. Their proxy looks like it's losing in Ukraine. Nothing's for certain, but that's where the smart money bets right now. What you think is, let's see what we can get away with. So let's deliver pinpricks here and pinpricks there and see how the great Satan responds, see what we can get away with. And if you're sitting in Beijing, from Xi Jinping's standpoint, he doesn't want a war in the Middle East. His oil would cost a great deal more. Asia is the main customer for Persian Gulf oil. China gets more than half of all its oil to the Persian Gulf, so they don't want a war that would blow up Iran's oil capacity. But on the other hand, Beijing is curious to see what the United States response is going to be. So they're gauging all of this, American strength and weakness, and trying to figure out what to do next. I'm quite sure the Chinese do not have a grand military master plan. 10 years ago, the Chinese plan was let the United States take care of securing sea lanes, and we ship the goods and we make the money.
You think that they just take advantage of America's weaknesses whenever they're exposed, like their reconciliation peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Absolutely. The Chinese are only beginning to develop a foreign policy. For all their rhetoric about a Palestinian state and the two-state solution and so forth, they've really done almost nothing diplomatically. They've just used a lot of rhetoric to try to embarrass Israel and assert their supposed leadership in the global South, because Israel's an American ally and they want to beat up the United States, so they'll beat up America's allies. Their actions have been negligible. So I think the best reading of China is they're looking at the United States weaken. They're quite sure the United States wants to suppress their economic development through technology sanctions. They're very paranoid about the United States, and we have to concede even paranoids have real enemies. So they're looking for ways of weakening the United States without showing their cards, without committing themselves in a way that would expose them. So they're enjoying Iran playing games with the United States. So for Iran's provocations are just below the level which would trigger a war. I'm not sure the Iranians know what they want. They want to see what they can get away with and figure out what they want.
I mean, I would argue that Iran was fully aware of what Hamas was going to do, and that at a minimum gave its blessings to the invasion of Iraq of Israel. I mean, and that certainly was no pinprick, nor is the war that Israel is fighting in Gaza. And that brings me really to the sort of the last thing that I want to talk about with you, which is Israel in this picture, because you paint a picture of the United States which is very discouraging, and the question of whether the decline is irreversible or not is really going to be in many ways contingent on the vote in November, which obviously Israel has no influence over. That's somebody else's issue. And so when Israel looks at the situation from a planning perspective, at least from my perspective, the way to look at it is to just take as a given that the United States is in decline and that it is not a reliable ally. But what would then be Israel's move? Because when you look at China, it did sign a strategic alliance with Iran. It is buying Iranian oil. It is supplying Iran, I think, with various weapons, and it's protecting them from sanctions at the UN Security Council, as is Russia, of course. And they're supplying them with weapons. Chinese weapons are just awash, apparently, in Gaza from IDF sources, as are North Korean weapons, and Russia. I mean, Russia we had a cooperative relationship with Russia until Naftali Bennett came into office in 2021. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, and it all sort of has gone downhill from there. And Russia has tightened its relationship with Iran. Iran is supplying Russia with drones that it's using to great effect, to lethal effect, as you mentioned in Ukraine. So and they've pledged to sell them advanced warplanes. So I mean, I'm looking at it and I'm wondering. You said that Israel has leverage room, but it feels like we're stuck right now. We put ourselves into a position of dependence on American weapon systems, and the Russians and the Chinese are not really. Not that we would ever want to replace the United States with either of them, because if the United States is undependable, then you can certainly say that goes double and triple and quadruple for the Russians and the Chinese. All the same, where is the leverage?
Well, as I'm sure you saw a couple of days ago, the Russians shot down a couple of Israeli cruise missiles over Syria. The explanation that the Russians are giving out through their own sources off the record is, in this particular case, the missiles came too close to Russian military infrastructure, and the Israeli liaison officer was a bit late in alerting them, so this was an unusual one-off event, but it's clearly a warning. Israel still has pretty much free rein in Syria to attack Iranian assets, and the Russians have allowed that to happen from the beginning, since 2015, when they moved into Syria. They're warning this might not always be the case. But Israel does need to maintain working relations with Russia, and it's well advised to stay as far as possible from the Ukraine issue, which is not an Israeli issue. The United States will put pressure on Israel to help in Ukraine. Israel should not. In the case of the Chinese have certain constraints. What Israel, in effect, can tell the Chinese is, nice little economy you have there, Mr. Xi. It would be ashamed if something were to happen to it. If Israel blows up Iran's two major oil terminals, the oil price goes up to $200 a barrel and the Chinese economy folds. So there's a great deal of leverage that Israel has with the Chinese to tell them, keep your Iranian dog on a leash, because if he bites us, the consequences are not going to be pretty for you. We can do a lot of damage, and they know it. Israel also has, according to the foreign press, nuclear weapons. If those get loose in the Middle East, a great deal happens. And then you've got leverage with the Gulf states, which don't like Iran. Now, per your comment, Caroline, I sincerely hope that Donald Trump is reelected president of the United States, although I have many disagreements with him. I believe he would move quickly to restore the Abraham Accords, shut down this Ukrainian disaster, and begin to stabilize the situation and improve America's strategic position. I think Israel needs to fight the white paper as if there's no war and fight the war as if there's no white paper. You're an American ally. You can't not be an American ally under the circumstances, but as you have argued, I think very correctly, Israel needs to move quickly to restore its independence in ammunition production and other key armaments. It has to improve its maneuvering room as much as possible. In the case of the Chinese aren't quite clear what they want, except to make things miserable for the United States in retaliation for the United States making things difficult for them. One of the biggest problems Israel has is you've never had a really important ambassador in Beijing. Your embassy in Beijing has been a poor cousin. The main thing to do with the Chinese is have someone in Beijing who can get to know the leadership, who has the gravitas to speak to them and talk about what they want and what the risks are. And this is both carrots and sticks. Obviously, what China wants from Israel is high technology. And you can't give it to them because you're an American ally, though there are certain exceptions. I don't think that can change or should change anytime soon. But the dialogue between China and Israel has been, except to the extent Netanyahu did it personally, has been very low level. So I think you need to find out more from the Chinese what they think they want and help them understand what the limits are to what they can get. So this is a very difficult situation and very uncertain. I think everyone in the world is circling the decline of the United States, trying to figure out how to respond to it. And Israel, to some extent, just has to try to increase its flexibility and keep its options open and hope that the United States comes back with a Donald Trump, but prepare for other contingencies.
One of the things that has been striking is the tepid and sort of manipulative way that the tepid response and the manipulative way that the Biden administration has responded to Israel's requests for military resupply. Barack Obama's MOU for U.S. military aid to Israel increased the amount to $3.8 billion a year, but essentially guaranteed that Israel's military industries would be starved out of the business by forcing Israel to use the money in the United States, so that rather than produce bullets and assault rifles in Israel or artillery shells in Israel closed down production lines starting, in 2018 when the MOU went into force, and
Yes.
went to the United States for things that it had been producing at home to a much greater degree than it is today. And we found ourselves obviously in a crisis on October 7th because we had put ourselves into a position of utter dependence on U.S. military resupply. And the United States has been using this apparently in order to try to coerce Israel to accept war aims that are antithetical to Israel's survival, including forming a Palestinian state comprised of terrorists in Judea and Samaria and in Gaza. And among many other things. And of course, on a tactical level of forcing Israel to resupply Hamas constantly under the headline of humanitarian assistance since almost the beginning of the war. And so when you look at this, and then the United States slowing down arms supplies, they still haven't been the supplemental military assistance has not been approved yet by Congress, and I am certain that the administration has a lot to do with the fact that Senator Schumer has blocked repeatedly it from being approved in the Senate. And so you look at this situation and it makes you wonder whether there's also, aside from maybe a hostile intent towards Israel, there's also simply a lack of capacity that beyond and above everything else, the United States has promised that it would be Israel's supplier of arms and that it was credible, but that due to the gutting of American manufacturing capabilities, particularly war materiel, and the way that they've just put all of these operations, all of these platforms, and all of these ordnance in the hands of Ukraine as fast as they can get it out, just means that the United States is largely tapped out now for helping Israel. I mean, how much of this is just that they don't have the capacity to do both?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm very sympathetic to the view of people like my friend Lyle Labowitz at Tablet Magazine that Israel should turn down American military aid to get rid of the strings. And because I read everything you write, I'm well aware of your point about Israel's deplorable dependence on the United States for key military supplies. So obviously Israel needs to bite the bullet and rebuild its capacity for ammunition, no pun intended. Now, everything Israel can do to increase its strategic flexibility, it should do. The American alliance is a given for the foreseeable future, and B'ezrat Hashem, Trump will come back and that alliance will be better than ever. But if it's not, you need to have ability to pursue other contingencies. You've had a good relation with Russia in the past. I would try to maintain if not a friendly, at least a working relation with Russia. China's MO is not to go around destroying people. China doesn't destroy, it assimilates. It thinks all of Asia should be effectively de facto provinces of the Chinese empire, paying tribute to the emperor and rotating around the Chinese magnetic center. You don't want that to happen. But it doesn't mean that you need to cut off relations with China. There are certainly things you can do with China which are legitimate, even within the scope of the American alliance. So I would look to see what those things might be. And again, I think Chinese policy is very much in flux right now. They don't have a master plan for world domination. They're an economic giant and a diplomatic dwarf that's now trying out its muscles to try to figure out how to be a diplomatic power. Remember, China's total forward deployment of soldiers around the world is 200. That's Marines sitting in Djibouti, and not counting engineers who are building airfields in the South China Sea. China does not have either the capacity or the interest to have massive forward deployment of forces. They're operating through proxies, through influence, and so forth, and trying to figure out how to do it. So have a conversation with them.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there for today, but it's certainly been edifying, if a bit discouraging. But I agree with you. I mean, and I've written and stated it for so many years as you have. But I mean, Israel is not a weak country. We're a powerful country in many key areas, and we should be concentrating on expanding our independent capabilities, not on doubling down on dependence. And this would be true even if the United States was a rising power. It's simply foolish to put yourself into a position of dependence on anybody, because
Absolutely.
why would anybody want to be? Why would anybody respect you when you're utterly dependent on them, even if you happen to be a good friend? So I think you're absolutely right, and we wish the best to the United States, and obviously like to see the bloodletting end in Ukraine and the Ukrainians emerge with their freedom intact in some form. But we'll just have to see how things go. And in the meantime, you're right, Israel should be exploring as many options as it possibly can while it fights this war. All right. And any last thoughts before we sign off, David?
Well, my prayers and thoughts are with the IDF and the civilians of Israel who are fighting a war right now. I'm confident that you will win that. And I think it's important to look beyond the immediate war and think about the bigger picture in a way that Israel has not yet. Israel really is a pocket superpower, and it has many capacities and many resources at its disposal. So I'm optimistic for the medium term, even though I see the difficulties.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Okay, guys, I'll see you later on this week. And in the meantime, don't take your eyes off this space. There's always something happening at the Caroline Glick Show. See you again soon. Take care. And thanks again, David.
Thank you, Caroline.